Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this IFS webinar as part of our series of events leading up to our Green Budget launch in about 10 days on the 13th of October. I'm Paul Johnson, I'm Director of the IFS, and I'm very pleased today to introduce two presentations of reports that we've put out this week. One looking at options for the Chancellor in the forthcoming spending review, and very closely related, one looking at issues around levelling up. What is the regional inequality that we face at the moment, and what are the sorts of things the Chancellor ought to be thinking about in terms of doing something about it? As I said, these are two chapters which will form part of our Green Budget coming out on the 13th of October. We're very grateful to the Nuffield Foundation for funding that, and we're also working with Citi, as you'll see on the 13th, in looking at the macroeconomic outlook and forecasts. Today, my colleagues Ben Zaranko and Alex Davenport will be presenting for about 15 minutes each, something along those lines. They will then have plenty of time for questions, which you can ask via Slido, which you should have a link to. That's all I'm going to say by way of introduction, other than to say that these are clearly immediate and important issues, which are both closely related to what's happening with COVID at the moment, but also, even if we didn't have the current COVID crisis, they would be big medium-term issues facing us. So both for immediate crisis-related reasons and for longer-term issue reasons associated with the economy, two very important pieces of work. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the forthcoming spending review, some of the context for that, some of the challenges the Chancellor will face and some of his options, and then Alex will talk a bit more about levelling up. Okay. The first thing to say is that a spending review is a difficult process at the best of times. In the absence of the pandemic, we'd have expected the Chancellor to be making decisions that would define large parts of the government's domestic policy agenda, making lots of delicate political and economic trade-offs along the way, and it would be a tricky process. Now, we're very much not in the best of times, and this year is going to be even more difficult than usual. That's for four primary reasons. The first, obviously, is the coronavirus pandemic, and its impact on the economy, on public finances, and on public services more directly. The second is the fact that it will come after a decade of austerity for public services. Some parts of the public sector have faced very deep cuts, and that makes for a difficult backdrop against which to be formulating public spending plans. The end of the Brexit transition period is looming on the horizon, which poses certain challenges as well. And the government is committed to this ambitious levelling up agenda, and its plans in that area will be subject to lots of scrutiny, not least from ourselves. And Alex will talk more about that in a minute. Now, the government needs to have some sort of spending review this year because departments' budgets don't exist beyond next March, and needs to set those for the 2021-22 financial year. And it probably has to do that before the end of this calendar year to give local governments time to plan their own budgets. As far as we're aware, the Chancellor is planning to plough on with a full or comprehensive spending review to set spending plans right through to the end of the Parliament, covering 3 or 4 years. In our view, he ought not to do so. The uncertainties at this moment are too great to be formulating multi-year spending plans. He should instead limit himself to just a single year, just set plans for next year, and then revisit those future plans at a moment when some of that uncertainty around the economy, around the public finances, and around the demands on public services has dissipated. Whether he opts just for a single year or whether for a full 3 or 4 year process, it's going to be challenging and there's going to be difficult trade-offs to make. I'm now going to talk through the big challenges that form the backdrop for this year's spending review. The first is the fact that it'll come on the back of a decade of austerity. So looking here at total government spending, so all spending that government does over the past 65 years or so, first as a share of the economy, you can see it oscillates a fair bit. You can see on the right-hand side, it's fallen quite steadily from its peak in the aftermath of the financial crisis to just before the pandemic, just shy of 40% of the economy. If we look in real terms, so after we've adjusted for inflation, you can see that what that's meant the last decade has been effectively spending's flatlined. It's barely increased at all in real terms, and in fact has fallen slightly in terms of spending per person. And that represents the longest sustained squeeze on public spending that we have on record. Now, despite that big sustained squeeze on spending, you can see that the size of the state, so government spending as a share of the economy, is actually, just prior to the pandemic, effectively where it was in 2007, 2008. So after a decade of Labour government, the size of the state was roughly the same as it was in March of this year, just before the pandemic. Now, the spending review isn't expected to cover total government spending. It's actually only expected to cover just over 40%. So if we look at total pot of government spending, just shy of 36% is what's classified in the jargon as resource departmental expenditure limits, or resource DEL. That's day-to-day spending by departments on operating and administering public services. Includes things like spending on hospitals and schools and prisons. And then a further 6.8% is capital DEL. So that's departments' investment budgets, investing in and maintaining assets like buildings and roads. And that is the portion of spending that the government thinks it can reasonably plan on a multi-year basis. And so it's subject to the spending review process. The rest of spending, which is classified as annually managed expenditure, or AME, is harder to plan because it's more demand-driven or outside of central government control. So about a quarter of all spending is on social security. Then there's various other bits as well, such as spending on debt interest, or spending by local and devolved governments that they finance locally through taxes that they control. So the focus today is going to be on those first two green parts of the pie, on DEL, but those other parts of spending are also important. So if we look at what's happened to spending over the last decade, as I showed you earlier, total spending per person has fallen slightly by 4.4%. If we look at spending on public services, so day-to-day spending on public services has fallen by 13% over the past decade, up to just prior to the pandemic. And if we strip out health, which has been repeatedly protected and prioritized, it's actually fallen by more than a quarter. So we spend a quarter less per person on public services than we did a decade ago. If you look at the department's investment budgets, you can see that they were cut very sharply in the first years after 2010. They've since increased, but they're still about a fifth lower than they were in 2019-20 versus a decade earlier. And within those totals, some parts of government have faced much bigger cuts than others. So some departments like justice, like housing and communities, for example, have faced very deep cuts, whereas the health budget and the aid budget have been relatively protected, for example. Now that makes for a challenging backdrop for Rishi Sunak. Even prior to COVID-19, many public services were showing signs of strain. In the prison system, for example, there were continuing increases in rates of violence and assaults between prisoners and staff. Parts of the court system were struggling, parts of the social care system and local government were struggling. That's even before the pressures associated with the pandemic. The past decade has also seen restraint in public sector pay, and relative to pay in the private sector, public sector pay is now at its lowest point in more than 25 years, and that's contributed to difficulties around recruitment and retention. So we know that initial teacher training recruitment targets were missed for 8 years on the trot, for example, and that's another thing that makes this a challenging backdrop for the Chancellor. There have been big cuts to working age social security, and so it's much more difficult to see how we could make savings there to pay for higher spending on public services. And perhaps unsurprisingly, given all of this, there were signs from the public prior to the pandemic that they were willing, at least in theory, to pay more in tax if that meant spending more on public services. So I'm showing you data here from the British Social Attitude Survey. And if you look at what was happening in 2010, there was a clear majority of people wanted to either keep tax and spending the same or to reduce it. But over the past decade, that's reversed. And now a majority of people want to increase levels of tax and spend, including, it should be said, a majority of Conservative voters. Now, this was prior to the pandemic, and preferences may have changed since, but there is clearly some appetite from the public for austerity to be brought to a decisive end. I want to turn quickly to Brexit, which is looming on the horizon. The transition period ends at the end of this calendar year. We still don't know what format or what form the future UK-EU relationship will take in terms of the trading relationship. For the spending review, there are three broad issues. The first is that Brexit adds further clouds of uncertainty around the economy and around the public finances that make it more difficult to be setting credible multi-year spending plans. The second is the fact that there's some spending that the EU currently does either in the UK, things like farm subsidies, research grants to universities, or regional structural funding, or spending on the UK's behalf, like spending on aid, that the UK government will have to either replace or at least decide which elements it wants to replace, and the spending review is a natural point to do that. And then some departments will face new responsibilities post-Brexit that will need more funding, presumably. So if HMRC has to employ thousands of customs agents, if the Home Office has to design a new immigration regime, or if DEFRA have to design and operate a new system of agricultural subsidies, all of that could require additional funding. Now, on levelling up, I don't want to say too much. I'll leave most of that for Alex in a moment. I do want to say that delivering a coherent levelling up programme alongside the challenges of COVID and Brexit will be tough, to say the least. It can't just be about spending. It can't just be about investment. It needs to encompass a broader range of policy areas. And there are lots of outstanding questions, not least about where, which I think Alex will be much more informative about. But nonetheless, the spending review is an opportunity to lay out some of the details, to provide something of a roadmap about what the government is seeking to achieve and how. Some of the areas the government's indicated we might expect movement on things like transport spending, spending on R&D, the potential for civil servants to be relocated outside of the capital, and then some place-based spending programs, whether that's renewing ones that already exist or designing new ones, or replacing those that are soon to come to an end, like the EU structural funding, for example. The spending review is a chance to lay out some of the detail there. I'm going to focus here on just the first two of those, transport and R&D. So to provide some context, first of all, transport investment is currently much higher in London than it is elsewhere in the country. So this is taking average spending per person over the past 5 years for which data is available. You can see that it's highest in Scotland and lowest in Wales and Northern Ireland on average. And then if you look within England, it's much higher in London than elsewhere. And in fact, transport investment per head in London is 2.8 times higher than the average for the rest of the UK. That's driven mainly by much higher spending on railways. And the government has indicated that it's going to be seeking to increase transport spending outside of the capital and try to rebalance that across the country. And if you look at public sector spending on R&D, you can see something similar. So the public sector is responsible for about a third of all R&D spending. If you look at how that varies across the country, again, it's highest in Scotland, lowest in Wales and Northern Ireland. And then within England, again, it's highest in London. And per person spending in London, South East and the East on R&D is about 1.8 times higher than the average for the rest of the UK. And again, we might see some efforts to narrow some of those gaps between regions. Now, COVID-19 clearly is the mother of all spanners in the works. It means that we have such a profound state of uncertainty about the future state of the economy, future demands on public services. And given that, it's just not the time to be holding multi-year spending review, but the government needs to hold a review of some sort. And it's not helped in that regard by the fact that departments have been allocated more than 70 billion this year for support for public services as part of the overall COVID response. That's just for public services, so it's on top of the costs of the furlough scheme, the uplift universal credit, and some forms of business support, etc. The health budget alone has been topped up by 35 billion, or about a quarter so far. And these are really big sums. And this doesn't include anything like there's been talk of a 100 billion moonshot testing program, for example. It doesn't include any of that. This is just what's been allocated so far. And these are very big amounts. And the big question really is, to what extent is that spending just a one-off? So is that higher procurement of PPE this year something that was just a blip, or is it going to have to continue? For how long does NHS test and trace need to be a feature of our lives? So that's the big crucial question underlying much of the spending review. And clearly it's highly uncertain, and that's why the Chancellor would be wise not to commit to too much over too long a time period. So now I want to consider some of the Chancellor's options. As a starting point, I'm going to show you his March plans for day-to-day spending. Now, these have been rendered obsolete, but they're still a useful starting point. So in the March budget, he published what at the time were intended to be firm and fixed spending plans. They implied real term spending growth for public services of 2.8% per year over the spending review period. Now, to put that in some context, at the Labour Party's manifesto at the election last year, their plans implied real terms growth of almost 7%, so it's considerably less generous than what we might see under Chancellor John McDonnell. And if we look at previous spending reviews, you can see that under Chancellor Gordon Brown in the 2000s, spending growth was repeatedly in excess of 4%, at least in terms of plans. Spending was cut back under the coalition government. And then last year, Sajid Javid at the 2019 spending round announced across-the-board increases in excess of 4%. So this is moderately generous by recent standards, but certainly no bonanza. Now, a lot has changed since March, to put it mildly. Those plans were, as I say, moderately generous. They've reversed about 2/3 of the cuts to per person public service spending over the past decade by the end of the spending review period. So that would reverse some of the austerity, but not all of it, at least on that definition. They're now completely obsolete, partly because of the huge amounts of coronavirus spending this year. We just don't know how much needs to continue. And also because of the change in the economic outlook, not just in terms of growth and tax revenues, which clearly have been extremely hard hit by the coronavirus-induced recession, the public health response-induced recession, but also because the outlook for inflation has changed. So we now expect lower rates of inflation over the next few years than what we were expecting back in March. So sticking to the same cash spending plans would actually mean faster real terms growth, because if we expect prices to be lower, the same cash budget can affect buy you more public services. You can employ more people, you can buy more materials. Since March, the Chancellor has explicitly rowed back from those plans. He's now committed only to increasing departmental budgets in real terms over the spending review period, which tells us very, very little. He could make them more generous, he could make them less generous. There are pressures in both directions. Now, there's lots of moving parts at the moment, which make it a very difficult time to be setting public spending plans, and also a difficult time to be analysing and explaining them. There are two key decisions which I think are useful for thinking about his options. The first is the baseline against which future increases will be calculated. So that's for this financial year in progress, 2020-21. And the second is the growth rate. So the generosity of increases after that point. To illustrate this, I'm going to show you here first the Chancellor's plans back in March on the most recent inflation forecasts. So 3.5% average growth over the period, with a 40 billion increase from around 360 billion this year to about 400 billion at the end. Now, let's say instead the Chancellor decides that about 20 billion of the coronavirus public service spending has to continue. That's about a quarter of the total. It's around what we've spent so far on NHS test and trace, plus about half what we've spent so far on PPE. Or you could think about it as having a pot of money that you can allocate in exceptional circumstances. Let's say it's 20 billion. That would mean topping up this year's plans by that much. And then if you reduced the growth rate to 1.7% over the period, he would end up spending the exact same amount in the final year. So what that would mean is that coronavirus spending would eat up half of the 40 billion increase and leave only 20 billion increase for everything else. And because of the government's commitments on things like the NHS and schools and police and levelling up, that would likely mean making cuts elsewhere. Now, that's just one option. Clearly, there are plenty more options available to the Chancellor. So to try and illustrate some of those, I'm going to show you a rather complicated chart, but hopefully you'll be able to bear with me. So on the horizontal axis, this is the amount added to the baseline for this year. So you can think about that as how much coronavirus spending has to be permanent, has to be baked into future plans. Then on the vertical axis, it's the real terms average growth rate. So every point on this purple line is consistent with spending the same amount in 2024 as he was planning in March. So March 2020 plans over here, where he adds nothing to the baseline and spending grows by 3.5%, or what I showed you in the previous chart, where he adds 20 billion to the baseline and reduces average growth to 1.7%, they're consistent with spending 400 billion in the final year. If instead he wanted to return to 2.8% growth, he could remove 8 billion from plans. That would be here, or any point on that line would achieve the same thing. If instead 18 billion of coronavirus spending is permanent and added to the baseline, average growth remains the same. You have to find an extra 20 billion in the final year. Or if you wanted to channel, as in a John McDonnell, and increase spending by 6.9% per year, that would mean finding an extra 40 billion in the final year of plans. So clearly, the Chancellor has lots of options available, but I think the key point here is that it's not just about the average growth rate, it's also about the baseline from which you start. And if he increases one but reduces the other, you could end up in much the same place. So when he does announce his spending plan, it's important to look behind the headline number and see what's actually going on. A few other considerations. First of all, public sector pay awards. This year, we expect public sector pay to outperform pay in the private sector, as lots of public sector workers receive above inflation pay awards, like teachers and police and so on have had those announced, whilst lots of private sector workers see their hours reduced, some of them lose their jobs and so on. So that's this year, but after that, the Chancellor has indicated that we might see a return to public sector pay restraint. We might see a return of something like the public sector pay cap to try and reverse what happens this year. But it's worth remembering the context that before the pandemic, public sector pay was at its lowest relative to private sector pay in more than a quarter of a century. And then also investment spending. So our focus so far mainly on day-to-day budgets, but capital budgets also need to be set. We've seen some increases to departments' capital budgets this year in response to COVID, but most of those have been paid for by underspends elsewhere or by bringing forward spending from future years. There's not much in the way of new money. And the government was announcing a so-called New Deal. There is a case for more investment spending to aid in recovery if it can be spent well. The government should avoid making cuts to capital budgets to pay for day-to-day spending pressures. If anything, to aid the recovery, the government should be thinking about where more investment could reasonably happen. Some final thoughts from me. Firstly, just to reiterate, the Chancellor could, and we think he should, set spending plans for next year only. At least on the day-to-day side, there may be more of a case for a multi-year capital spending settlement, but on day-to-day spending, at least a single year of plans would be wise. He's emphasised the need for tough choices, and so what that may mean is we see a more generous settlement in the short term, and then talking big about all the spending restraint and all the belt tightening we're going to do later on. Within that, we know that NHS budgets are certain to increase. The only question is really by how much. The government has other commitments on things like the police, on schools, on defence, on levelling up. And so it's very difficult to see if they do announce a tighter spending settlement in future years, how you could achieve that without either finding substantial amounts of additional cash or making cuts to other public services. Some of those will have already faced a decade of austerity, and it could be extremely challenging to impose further cuts at this moment. And then more generally, given the broader pressures on spending, not just from the pandemic, but also from an aging population, from the fact that the public might want to see a more resilient health service, a more generous social care system, a stronger social security net. All of that combined with the fact that we now expect the economy to be smaller than we were expecting. All of that points towards a bigger state in the years to come. And that will be a big choice for a Conservative Chancellor to make. Thanks a lot. I'll now hand over to Alex to talk about levelling up.
Thanks for that, Ben. So yes, as Ben said, I'm now going to talk more about levelling up, specifically where we might target and how we might go about achieving this. So to provide some of the initial context, the government's made a clear and strong commitment to tackling regional inequalities in the UK and helping left behind areas. And this was a strong theme ever since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister and formed a key part of the 2019 Conservative election manifesto. Since then, the government have also linked levelling up to recovery from the COVID-19 crisis with their Build Back Better agenda. And so it's been a key theme for this government. However, neither this objective nor the rhetoric is particularly new. UK regional inequalities are very deep-rooted and arguably go back decades, if not a whole century. And as far back as 2003, even the specific phrase levelling up was featuring in Treasury documents. So this is an issue that many governments have tried to tackle, but have arguably not succeeded in tackling. However, even with this government's programme, we're still waiting on a lot of the details about how they hope to succeed where others perhaps haven't. In particular, we don't really know what they're hoping to achieve, where they're going to target, and how they're planning on doing this. And hopefully we can maybe shed some light on some of these issues. So just to provide some context for the whole idea of levelling up, we're just first of all going to explore how geographically unequal the UK is in an international context. The short answer is it's very geographically unequal, and in fact the UK consistently ranks among the most geographically unequal of the developed countries. So for this chart we took several OECD countries for which we have data on GDP per capita for sub-regions. In the UK there's around 200 of these sub-regions. We then ranked these sub-regions by GDP per capita and looked at the ratio between the 90th and 10th percentiles. And in the UK this is the equivalent of the ratio between Aberdeen and Durham. So on the 90-10 measure, the UK ranks as the most geographically unequal of the developed countries we've looked at. And even on the 80-20 measure, it is among the most geographically unequal. And in fact, in the chapter, you'll see that on several other measures we've also looked at, this story holds true. And so the UK appears consistently fairly geographically unequal. However, this is not the complete picture, as GDP per capita is not a perfect measure of this. And previous IFS research has found that once you account for things like housing and living costs, that it may be a bit less clear. However, taking that the UK is fairly geographically unequal, where are these left behind parts that are driving this geographical inequality? Well, it's important to clarify that there's no clear definition of where is left behind. The government may have a different idea to, for example, what we've come up with, and it may mean different things to different people. However, to shed some light on this, we've constructed a simple measure of how left behind an area is, considering 4 factors: pay, the proportion of the population with degree level qualifications, the proportion claiming incapacity benefits, and the proportion in employment. And we combine these measures into a single index. This has been done on a local authority level. For Great Britain, data limitations for Northern Ireland mean it wasn't possible to construct this index there. We then map this measure by quintiles or fifths of the index. These areas can be found across the country, and there's no single type of place that is left behind, but there are some clear patterns that emerge. It's also important to clarify that this is the situation from before the COVID-19 pandemic, which may have changed things, as we'll explore later. So these maps show precisely what our left behind measure gives, and focusing on the left-hand side, which is just the UK, remembering that the darker red shaded areas are the most left behind, you can already see some clear patterns, with South Wales, the northeast, and a belt across the north of the country, which is similar to the red wall that featured so prominently in the 2019 election, appearing the most left behind. Focusing on some specific patterns within this, one of the key types of areas that are considered left behind on our measure are coastal communities. For example, you can see that Margate in Kent, Clacton in Essex, parts of Norfolk and Lincolnshire, as well as West Wales, all appear relatively left behind. These coastal communities have suffered from a declining fishing industry and perhaps a tourism industry that is no longer what it once was, as well as being relatively isolated. Beyond these coastal communities, we can also see the kind of classic example of a left behind area, provincial towns, particularly in the north of England. And you can see this on the submaps focusing on the northeast, south and west Yorkshire, and the northwest. Many of these towns, which are former industrial towns that used to have significant employment in coal mining, steel, or textiles, have never fully recovered from the deindustrialisation of the 1980s and suffer from persistent deprivation as well. Beyond these towns, also many of the cities outside of London appear relatively left behind, and you can see that Glasgow, Newcastle, Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham are all among the area that is the fifth of areas that are most left behind. These towns are also relatively post-industrial and have suffered since the 1980s. And the UK is different to many other developed countries in this area, in that our second-tier cities, such as these, are not the engines of growth, productivity, and wealth that they are in many other developed countries. And this is something that Levelling Up may seek to address. So these are the areas that may traditionally have been considered left behind. However, the UK economy is currently undergoing 2 massive shocks, one of which is the current COVID-19 pandemic, and the other is the upcoming end of the transition arrangements following the UK's departure from the EU. Focusing first on the impact COVID-19 could have, clearly the impacts of this pandemic will vary greatly by area and might be quite profound and long-term. However, we focus on the short-term economic impacts since there's great uncertainty over these longer-term impacts. And we look at the share of workers that work in affected industries. These are industries that were shut down during the first lockdown and may continue to face restrictions in any future lockdown. We also look at the proportion of eligible workers within each local authority that were ever furloughed and the fall in job vacancies from April to June, year on year, 2019 to 2020 on the government's Find a Job website. Again, there's data limitations for Northern Ireland that mean we focus on Great Britain. And in addition to this, we do the same as before, constructing an index of these measures and mapping by quintiles, which can be seen here, with again, red shaded areas representing those most exposed. Unlike with left behind areas, no clear spatial pattern emerges. However, there are some key trends again. The first of these is that rural and coastal areas look particularly badly exposed to COVID-19. You can see this in the southwest of the country, in particular around Cornwall and Dorset, as well as in parts of Norfolk, Lincolnshire, and the Lake District, as well as West Wales, all of which look badly exposed. These areas have large hospitality sectors and are quite reliant on tourism, and these may suffer going forwards as COVID-19 continues and have suffered so far. Beyond these areas, the other key area that looks most exposed to COVID-19 are large cities, this time including London. So you can see that London looks relatively badly affected, as do the city centres of Liverpool, Manchester, Newcastle and Glasgow, whilst Sheffield and Birmingham are also in the second fifth of most exposed areas. Again, this is because cities are very dependent on the hospitality and tourism sectors, as well as having large retail sectors. And previous work by the Centre for Cities has shown that larger city centres have been much slower to recover after the lockdown than other areas, and so these appear to be the most badly affected. It's important to consider whether the areas that are most badly affected by COVID-19 may also have already been those that were considered most left behind. The simple answer to this is that there's no systematic relationship between the two measures. Areas that were most badly affected by COVID-19 were not necessarily always left behind before. On this chart, we show the proportion of local authorities within each fifth of our left behind index that are also in the most badly affected fifth of the COVID-19 index. So for example, as you can see here, around 22% of local authorities in our most left behind fifth were also in the most impacted fifth by COVID-19. If there was no systematic relationship between the two measures, we would expect around a fifth or 20% of areas within each left behind fifth to also be in the most impacted COVID-19 fifth. And as you can see from here, this is effectively the case. So this means there's no systematic relationship between the two. What this does not mean is that there's no areas that were in the most left behind fifth and are also in the most impacted areas by COVID-19. And in fact, those areas contained in this top bar will be badly affected on COVID-19, and we're already in the most left behind fifth. These areas can be seen shaded red in this map, and these are areas that were already left behind and have been badly hit now. As you may have picked up from some of the maps explored earlier, there's two key types of areas that fit this description. First of all, there's coastal communities such as Torbay, the Isle of Wight, Margate, bits of Norfolk, Lincolnshire and Wales, as well as Blackpool. These areas were left behind, as we explored earlier, due to declining fishing industries and tourism industries, and have significant legacies of deprivation. However, they also are still very exposed to the sort of industries most badly affected by COVID-19. In addition to these areas, some of the larger cities of the UK outside of London, such as Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow and Newcastle, also look badly affected by COVID-19 and were already left behind. Again, for similar reasons relating to a current reliance on hospitality and tourism, mixed with a legacy of deindustrialisation and deprivation. These sorts of areas may require particular attention. However, in general, the fact there's no systematic relationship between the two measures suggests that combining Building Back Better and COVID-19 recovery with the levelling up agenda may not be that effective, as it tends to be different areas that are affected, whilst the impacts of COVID-19 may be more short-term, whereas the levelling up agenda is dealing with very deep-rooted and long-term problems. Finally, Brexit may have an impact too. The UK is due to exit its transitional arrangements with the EU at the end of December, and there's huge uncertainty around what form of post-Brexit trade relationship will continue after this point. Studies on the impact of Brexit have consistently found that those hardest hit will be workers with lower levels of formal qualifications and workers in manufacturing industries, and often many workers will fit both categories. These workers tend to be concentrated in already left behind areas that retain significant industrial bases, particularly the North East, South Wales and the West Midlands. And this means that the levelling up picture may be complicated by Brexit, with these areas potentially having their industrial bases further undermined by a hard Brexit and a lack of trading arrangement following departure from the EU. This is particularly salient in recent days as it's emerged that the car industry may face particular problems due to the ability to export third country parts to the EU. And this will particularly affect the North East and West Midlands, which retain significant employment in car manufacturing, highlighting the issues that may occur. So we've looked at where may be considered left behind, and also how COVID-19 and Brexit might complicate this picture. Ben's already looked at some of the issues in the spending review the government might wish to consider, and we go into a lot more detail in this in the chapter itself, but I'll now briefly outline some of the issues the government ought to consider going forwards. The government needs to set out very clearly what levelling up is trying to achieve and which areas need to be targeted so that it can come up with a coherent policy framework. In particular, by levelling up, does it mean it wishes to equalise wealth and GDP per capita between areas, or is it sufficient for growth to be increased in some of these left behind areas? And also, which sort of area does it want to target? Is it completely focused on towns in the north of England, as well as these coastal communities? Or is it also going to target some of the larger cities, which have also been left behind and may be engines of future growth? Beyond this, any schemes the government then comes up with which we'd expect to hear about in the coming year, we'll need to carefully take account of several factors, including the length of funding cycles. The current EU structural funds, for example, which are due to run out at the end of this year, the government has already announced these will be replaced by the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. These EU structural funds ran in 7-year cycles, which gave local areas certainty and the ability to plan long-term investments, and the government might wish to consider matching this with any future schemes. Generally, local flexibility is going to be key. As we saw earlier, there's no single area that's considered left behind, no single type of area, and the needs of a coastal community like Blackpool may vary greatly from a larger city such as Glasgow or Manchester. So there's no one-size-fits-all policy solution. In addition to this, transport investment will not always be the answer. Some areas will benefit from a new railway or investment in bus networks, but other areas may better benefit from investment in skills, for example, or cultural factors. Beyond this, both capital and revenue funding will also be important. Local government budgets have already been stretched over recent years, and if only capital funding is provided, which will allow areas to build perhaps a new skills college or a new transport network, but not have any funding to run it going forwards, this can pressure further already squeezed local authority budgets. And so the government ought to consider ensuring there's sufficient revenue funding. And alongside this, it's going to be an important role for local government and increase local government funding in dealing with this. Finally, it's important that the government doesn't reinvent the wheel. It can build on and rationalise existing schemes. So there's already at least 8 place-based schemes in England, including the Towns Fund, the Transforming Cities Fund and the Coastal Communities Fund. These target different areas and direct funding to different types of schemes, but the government ought to consider rationalising some of these schemes, or at least not adding new ones, as this may introduce excessive complexity that can confuse the picture. Instead, it may wish to improve on existing schemes. So, in conclusion, the issues around levelling up and left behind areas are very long-term and deep-rooted. They've been around for a long time and won't be solved in a single parliament. Complex and long-term solutions are going to be needed. A carefully planned agenda that encompasses more than just spending is also going to be needed. As Ben mentioned, transport spending alone will not solve the issues. We'll also need to consider reform of the tax system, reform of devolution, planning law, skills and education spending, among many other policy areas that are involved in this. And it's going to take a long time and some careful thought to implement levelling up effectively. Thank you for listening. Thanks.
Well, thanks ever so much, Alex and Ben. We've got a growing number of questions on Slido, so do add some more if you'd like. I mean, one I will read out is for Ben. Well done, a very good presentation. That's the kind of question we like. There's a number of questions, really, I suppose, about what do other countries do about regional inequality and why have successive governments in the UK failed to address the issue. Before I ask you to respond to that, I've also been following some of the commentary on Twitter, and there's one thing that's quite interesting. Tara Alice of McKinsey, so she's irritated that we're saying that regional inequality in the UK is much bigger than it is elsewhere. And I think it's worth just adding a little clarification to that. It does matter, of course, what it is that you're measuring and how you're measuring it. What Alex was looking at there was GDP per capita, which is a particular economic measure of inequality. We've published something earlier in the year, actually, looking at other measures, including looking at median incomes, and particularly median incomes after housing costs. If you compare those regionally, actually we have much less inequality than it would appear looking at some of these GDP measures, partly because median incomes are less unequally distributed. A lot of the inequality is associated with where high earners live. So the main reason that London and the South East is richer than parts of the North is not because there aren't any poor people in London and the South East. It's just that that's where most of the rich people live. And of course, there is a lot of inequality within both broader and smaller local regions. So I think it is quite important to be clear about that. But on this question of why haven't we successfully done anything to deal with the regional inequalities that undoubtedly exist. I don't know whether Ben or Alex, you would like to have a go at that.
Yeah, sure. I think the first thing to say is that because it's really hard, a lot of these inequalities are driven by, structural forces related to technological change and globalization and kind of the role of the financial sector in the UK economy. And some of these things are affecting countries across the world, and it's not within any government's control to, shape them as it might wish. That's not to say there isn't more that they could have done in the way of policy responses, but I think it's important to bear that in mind. Secondly, I think that the UK is relatively unusual in an international context. Its degree of centralisation and the share of government spending done by central government as opposed to local governments. Now, in some countries like the US, that's got a very strong federal system. In places like Germany, a lot more spending is done locally. But that's not just about government spending. It's tied up into a whole system of government and a whole system of devolution and politics and so on. And if you look at what's happened over the past decade, local government spending in England at least and across the UK has been cut back quite sharply, while some parts of central government have been more protected. And so that's kind of exacerbated that. And as Alex said, a key thing, if you want to be successful in this endeavour, is to allow for local flexibility and for solutions to reflect the nature of local problems. And so the role of local government in that is important. And I think that it needs to be considered in a broader picture of devolution and a broader agenda. So I haven't perfectly answered the question, but hopefully at least said something useful.
And yeah, just to add to, I noticed some comments about an international comparison of whether other places have managed to do this successfully. I think the two best examples in a European context to look at would be Germany with the former East Germany. Germany spent large amounts of money trying to reconstruct East Germany, and it hasn't necessarily succeeded in raising incomes in East Germany to be in line with those in West Germany. And the same is also true in Italy, where there's been consistent efforts over the years to address the north-south divide in Italy. And again, it hasn't had massive impact. So it's quite clear that it's a very difficult thing to address. And even large amounts of spending don't necessarily achieve this if you don't go about it in a very carefully and well thought out way.
Yeah, and it's worth, when Alex rather modestly says large amounts of money, we are talking stupendous amounts of money moving from the former West Germany to the former East Germany, which has been successful in bringing some of the cities of East Germany up towards West German levels, but certainly not successful across the piece. These are very deep-rooted issues, and I do think the UK struggles with, as Ben was saying, a couple of deep-rooted problems. One is the lack of local and regional government and institutions. Another, actually, I think, is the lack of long-term focus on these things. People have been worried in England and the UK about regional inequalities for a very long time. Going back at least 100 years. But things like education policies, skills policies, infrastructure policies, even local government policies have not been in any sense consistent, even over 5 or 10 years, let alone over very long periods of time. And one very good example, I think, is our failure on education, and particularly vocational and further education policies. Looking at some of these other questions, the most popular one at the moment is sort of rather difficult one about how new work patterns might affect local economies. And I think the answer to the question is yes, clearly, if people do spend more time working at home and less time in city centres, that is going to be a significant problem for city centre economies. We're not going to know whether that's happening for some period, a couple of years at least. But if it does, then I think there's a real challenge for governments to determine how to respond to that. And the answer is probably not to try and ensure that city centre economies remain the same as they always have been. If people's behaviour changes that much, then we're going to have to support economies to adapt rather than trying to keep them preserved. That is really hard because the process of adaptation can be very painful and result in a lot of people losing significant amounts of money. So that's going to be a real challenge at a sort of more micro or local level for central and local government, if that is the kind of thing that will happen.
Can I just add something to that, Paul?
Yes, you certainly can.
I think it's also important to bear in mind that if those shifts do last, and I think it is very much an if, that also is going to change the balance of the sorts of infrastructure projects, for example, you might want to pursue. The case for a big new Crossrail 3, 4, whatever number it is, it might be weakened substantially if there's fewer people commuting into the centre of London. You might want to think more about how people's transport patterns change, and all these things will matter when the government's thinking about its levelling up agenda and the sorts of policies it wants to pursue. Now, if the pandemic is very short-lived, people might bounce much more quickly back to their previous patterns of consumption and living. But if this lasts for years, these things could become much more entrenched, and it's just so up in the air at the moment. We just don't know. But it's important to distinguish between that long-term potential structural change in the economy and in society versus the more short-term impacts that we've focused on in terms of the number of workers affected and changes in job vacancies and that immediate economic downturn. I think the two are distinct and they could possibly run in different directions.
It's also true that COVID-19 may impact on the kind of levelling up picture to the extent that if it shifts workers outside London and outside the big cities to more provincial towns where people are happier to live and perhaps commute to the city they work in maybe once or twice a month or whatever, then that actually may do some of the levelling up kind of by design. But then on the other side of that is that although London clearly wasn't particularly considered left behind, some of the places that were already left behind are cities outside London, and these may suffer further if that process happens, even if that then benefits towns surrounding those cities. So actually the longer term implications of this, and we won't know how this plays out for a while, really could have quite a profound impact on even where you want to target for levelling up, not just the sort of policies you want to implement.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really a response to another question here about, if remote working does become normal, doesn't that sort of almost naturally lead to white collar workers and high productivity workers dispersing away from the southeast and thus reducing inequalities? And that is certainly at least a possibility. But as we said, I'm not going to speculate on the level of probability of that scale of change. It's a very broad question here. I don't know whether you want to have a shot at this one, Ben. Where would the IFS like to see greater focus during the upcoming spending review? I mean, that's a little unfair.
Right.
It's a very broad question, but what do you think the priorities ought to be?
Okay, so first of all, I think the priority should be not setting non-credible spending plans that no one expects to be stuck to. Don't plow ahead with a 4-year spending review and set plans you have no intention of actually adhering to further down the line. That doesn't help the sustainability of the public finances. Do a single year this year, and we can revisit these big questions next year once this cloud of uncertainty is hopefully somewhat behind us. In terms of where I'd like the focus to be, I think that if you look at what the story's been over the past decade, it's basically been more money for health and everything else being squeezed. Now, there are very good arguments for more health funding generally, and particularly in the midst of and the aftermath from a pandemic. But I think there's always talk and there's always pressure to move towards thinking more about prevention and to think more about kind of a holistic view of health, and people's housing matters, people's employment matters, people's all sorts of things matter for their health. But what we've seen is the health sector gets more money and things like social care get squeezed, local government services have been cut quite substantially. So I'd like to see more focus on, it's hard, I'm not saying this is easy, but more focus on kind of taking steps now that might have benefits maybe 10, 15 years down the line, rather than those just in the immediate future. So that might mean a more generous settlement for local government than we've seen over the past decade. That might mean thinking about reform to the social care funding system. That might mean more money for traditionally ignored areas and neglected areas like parts of justice and probation and services like that, rather than becoming a government that basically has a huge, ever-growing health service while everything else gets squeezed around it. And also some reckoning with the fact that if we do want to have a more generous system of public services and a more generous health system and grapple with the costs of an aging population, we have to think about what that means for taxes in the medium term as well, and how we're going to pay for all of that. Not all of that's probably going to be tackled this year, but there's some broad issues there that hopefully the Chancellor will pay service to.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, Ben's really emphasized there the extraordinary degree to which spending on health is taking up a bigger and bigger fraction of total spending, and that is something that we're going to have a serious debate about at some point. I guess the thing I would add is that whatever the government decides in terms of how it wants to deal with the fiscal deficit, whether it wants to deal with it or not, I think the one big piece of learning from the 2010s, where the focus of economic policy really was overwhelmingly on reducing the fiscal deficit, it's clearly the case that we also need an economic policy, and that should have meant in the 2010s not slashing investment spending, for example, back in 2010 and 2011. And a focus on both the tax and spending and other policies which might have done something for growth and productivity. And the response to this crisis can't just be focused on what the appropriate level of deficit should be. It needs to be on the quality of spending, tax, and economic policy as well. Looking at the other questions here, I mean, there is a question here about should tax increases be part of the solution? Well, in the long run, I think inevitably we're going to have tax increases for three reasons, really. The first is that I think for the reasons that Ben has set out, spending is probably going to be higher than expected. Secondly, the economy is probably going to be smaller than expected. And thirdly, of course, the population continues to age and the pressure on health spending continues. So we'll say more about that in our main green budget on the 13th of October. But I think the key point there is in terms of increasing taxes, that's something for the medium run. It is not something for this year, next year, or probably even the year after, when we really need to be focusing on supporting the economy. There's a question here about government investment to tackle climate change. How's that likely to be impacted by the difficulties in long-term planning? Well, I mean, that clearly is something that has to be planned long-term. And I don't think what Ben was saying is that there's nothing that can be planned long-term. But what we don't know 2, 3, 4 years down the road is what the size of the economy will be and what the appropriate overall fiscal policy and total level of spending will be. But that's not to say that we can't set out a long-term strategy for dealing with climate change, both public investment, the role of carbon taxes, and in particular, the role of government policies to move to zero carbon transport, zero carbon heating, and so on. Those things are perfectly doable in the context of current uncertainty, and indeed should be done. What else have we got? What difference does it make that we're not having a budget this year? I think probably not an enormous amount, but Ben, Alex, do you have any thoughts on the lack of budget? I mean, it really is quite frustrating of recent chancellors. We do all of our work for the green budget this year, and indeed last year, to bring out in October in the expectation of an autumn budget, which we're promised, and then both this year and last year, they were cancelled with no thought whatever to the IFS, I'm afraid. But Ben, any thoughts on what the lack of a budget this year might mean?
Yeah, so we're still expecting to get a new set of economic and fiscal forecasts from the Office for Budget Responsibility, but it does mean that the Chancellor's, I think in the context, that it defensively saying he wants to wait and see how this winter pans out before making any of the big decisions. He may come back before the next budget with another package of support. This doesn't mean that he's just not going to say anything until next year. It does mean that the spending review will be done on its own without any accompanying decisions on tax and on other parts of government policy. I think if anything, that strengthens the argument not to do a full multi-year spending review. If you're going to be setting out huge amounts of spending commitments 3-4 years into the future, that should be done alongside decisions around, levels of social security spending, about thinking about the outlook for the public finances and your fiscal framework and your broader plans for fiscal policy. I think there's a strong argument for doing all of that together, which would be another argument for delaying that big decision until next year. It does mean that if you think about the levelling up agenda, clearly the spending review will have some things to say in the form of spending on transport and R&D, for example. But as I said, and as Alex said, it needs to be a broader policy picture. You have to be thinking about tax reform, you have to be thinking about planning law, you have to be thinking about devolution, you have to be thinking about skills and education. And lots of those things don't fall within the purview of the spending review. They'll be more likely to be within a budget. And so, some of those decisions will be kicked into the long grass.
It also seems to be the case that delaying the budget has gone alongside delaying decisions on some of the local devolution type spending on the Shared Prosperity Fund and local growth deals, which have now been pushed back to announcements being next year, whereas those things need addressing relatively soon just because the funding for the existing schemes they're replacing is running out at the end of this year. And so it has an implication for levelling up from that perspective as well.
No, that's a very good point. It is remarkable, isn't it? More than 4 years after the referendum result, one of the, you'd think, more straightforward things directly in the hands of the UK government to decide is how to make regional spending available and replace the European schemes. And we still know pretty much literally nothing about how that's going to be done. And again, we have a publication from earlier in the year that you can find on our website looking specifically at some of the options around that shared prosperity fund. One comment on Slido, which is pertinent to this set of questions about the budget, is the lack of budget clearly has an impact on devolved administration budget arrangements, which is unhelpful. And so they're in the same boat as the IFS in that sense.
Yes. Sorry, actually, Paul, could I add something on that as well? From the maps, the pretty maps that Alex showed, it showed that some of the areas that we see as being left behind, and some of those areas being both left behind and vulnerable to COVID, there's large parts of Wales and there's parts of Scotland as well. And a lot of the existing place-based spending programmes are England only. In some cases, there are comparable schemes in Scotland and Wales, but lots of this is a devolved matter. Some of the decisions made in Westminster will just be for England. Some will be for the UK, but some will be for England only. And so there is definitely an angle on this, which is how the English response fits into the Scottish and the Welsh and the Northern Irish response, and how different governments might make different decisions about how they choose to pursue it. So I really think it's important to remember that.
Great, thank you. Well, we are now at 10:58, so I think we should probably draw a close. I'll draw a close with the last comment on my list here, which is fantastic presentations, which I obviously agree with. Thank you, Ben and Alex. Will the slides be shared? Yes, if they're not already on the IFS website, they will be very soon on the IFS website, as are the two chapters that two reports that Ben and Alex have been speaking about, where you'll find much more detail. So thank you everyone for listening. Thank you, Ben and Alex, for those great presentations. Thank you to Nuffield Foundation and the City for working with us on the Green Budget this year. And just to remind you that the main Green Budget output will be on the 13th of October, but we also have a further report next week looking at the options around benefit spending. Remember, the Chancellor has allocated an extra 9 billion for universal credit, local housing allowance, and so on this year, and we'll be looking at his options for that for next week. So I hope you can join us then and again on the 13th. Thank you very much to everybody.